to our studies called Archives. Last week we looked at Reformation Christianity. This week we're going to take a look at Colonial Christianity, when the gospel comes across the ocean over to America. You see, every place the Reformation touched, there was a polarization. People either loved it and they were Protestant, or they hated it because they were Catholic. Except in England. England was the only place that there was not this polarization of Catholic and Protestantism. And the reason for this is because in England, they merged the two together the best they knew how to do. And that's what we know today as the Anglican Church. It is a almost down the middle divide of Protestant theology and Catholic religiosity, Catholic ceremony, Catholic tradition, but Protestant in theology. Now, when this happens, the Protestants don't like it one bit. They hate it. And they will do what had not been done anywhere else when this happens. 30,000 Protestants will leave England to land on the shores of America in what they will call the New England, the New World. How does this come to be? How does 30,000 Protestants end up going over to America? Well, if we take it back to where it begins with a guy named Henry VIII. You have probably heard that name in a song before, but Henry VIII of England and his wife Catherine were zealous Catholics, very zealous Catholics. They hated Protestants. However, Henry has this problem. His wife has given him 5 kids, 4 of them had died, and the only one that is left is a daughter that's named Mary. Now, Henry did not want to leave his kingdom to a female. Even though it was his daughter, he did not want to leave his kingdom to a woman. What he needed was a new wife in order to have kids. But that is very hard to do if you are a 15th century or 16th century Catholic. You can't just up and divorce your wife. In fact, Henry tried to get a divorce from his wife. He went to the Pope and he told the Pope his family was cursed because Catherine used to be married to his brother, and now what they're doing now is incest, but the Pope didn't buy it. And he wouldn't grant a divorce. So Henry found a way to break ties with the Catholic Church. He'll just start his own church, the Church of England, which becomes known as the Anglican Church or the Episcopal Church. So the Church of England didn't have a pope. When Henry VIII started this church, it didn't have a pope. It had a king. He was the sovereign. Henry VIII, he was the spiritual leader. Or he was the leader of the church in general, but the spiritual leader was an archbishop known as Thomas Cranmer. So you had Henry VIII, who was the leader of it all. The spiritual leader was Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. So Henry finally divorces Catherine, and he marries a woman by the name of Anne Boleyn. Sadly, Anne Boleyn could not give Henry a male child, just one daughter named Elizabeth. And when Henry saw that he was not going to be able to have children with Anne Boleyn, he charged her with incest and had her head cut off. That was Henry VIII. In fact, a lot of English writings call Henry VIII a stain of blood and oil in England. He was a brutal man. Well, Henry ended up marrying a woman by the name of Jane Seymour. And I know you may know Jane Seymour as Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman. But this is not that Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour gave birth to a baby boy. Believe it or not, Henry VIII and Jane Seymour had a baby boy. And they named him Edward VI. But he was very sickly and he died young. But before he died, Edward VI had Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop, write down what he called 42 articles. This was 42 writings about the belief of the church, and it was primarily Protestant. And this caused the Anglican Church, the Church of England, to take a Protestant swing more than it was Catholic. After the death of Henry VIII and after the death of Edward VI, the sole child of Henry and Catherine was Mary. Mary the First, they called her. She became queen. And she was a very zealous Catholic. In fact, she was so Catholic that she had every notable Protestant put to death, and it earned her the nickname Bloody Mary. After her, the Protestants fled England, went to Geneva, Switzerland. When Mary died, Elizabeth I, the daughter of Henry and Anne Boleyn, becomes queen. Now, she's responsible for the beginning of colonization in America. Elizabeth was called the Virgin Queen, and one of the first colonies set up in America is called Virginia, which is based on her, named after her. You see, when Elizabeth would send explorers over and they would begin colonizing, they were bringing back tobacco and cotton. That's why a lot of the names of the eastern coast cities are the names of cigarette brands, Marlboro and Kent and Salem, because all of that come from the colonization that Elizabeth put into practice. The Protestants were living in Geneva, and it was like a wonderland to them. This was Calvin's Geneva. This was the city of God. They loved how everything was Protestant there, and it ran under a Protestant government. But when Bloody Mary died and Elizabeth became queen, the Protestants that had fled to Geneva came back to England at this point. And they longed for that Calvinistic government that they had in Geneva, that they had in Switzerland. So this group began to protest every Catholic-like thing that came up with the church. And because of their longing to be pious and live the Protestant life, they became known as the Puritans. They wanted to purify religion. So they were known as the Puritans. You see, in England, you didn't have Lutherans and Calvinists and Zwinglians or Baptists. England was trapped in this hybrid of Anglicanism. They were trapped in this hybrid of half Protestant, half Catholic. And no one liked it. It was too Catholic for the Protestants and too Protestants for the Catholics. No one was enjoying what the church was doing in England. As Elizabeth was on her deathbed, because she had no children, she suggested that James VI, the King of Scotland, come and rule the British Empire and be over London and Scotland and be over the first king of a united kingdom. And that's what he did. England is hoping that James will bring Protestant Presbyterian beliefs into England to break up this Anglicanism, to break up what the Church of England was doing. And everybody had their hopes and dreams attached to King James. But guess what? He let them down. Their hopes were dashed because they found out that King James was a homosexual. This offends the people of England. They call him the Sodomite king. James also further offended the people of England by appointing William Laud as the archbishop. William Laud blatantly put Catholic practices back into the church. That's why the preachers had to wear robes, and they had to wear collars, and they had to have certain candle holders made out of silver and certain metals. And I mean, it was very Catholic in its practice. And it was during the reign of James I that many Puritans spoke of leaving England. The people who spoke of leaving, those who wanted to travel away, to journey away, they called them pilgrims. So this radical fringe of English Puritanism were pilgrims. So the Puritans that said, we don't want to just purify, we want to move away from here, sojourn to another place, they called them the pilgrims. They left England and they went to Holland. And they formed their commune there and they called it the New Israel. The Pilgrims did not believe in a separation of church and state. They wanted it all mixed together, but they wanted to appoint Christian men to be in positions of power and authority. So this was very much like the Anglican Church, but just real heavy on Protestant theology and Protestant practice. The Pilgrims living in Holland, they did not like what they perceived because Holland at that time was considered very liberal. Not to mention that they were losing their English language because the children of these pilgrims were beginning to speak Dutch. And they were losing the English language. And the pilgrims said, we can't stay here. We need to find another home. When Elizabeth was queen, we talked about earlier that she had already sent explorers over that had begun colonizing America, the Virginia territory. Well, these pilgrims said, we'll go there. We will go to America so that we can have the religious freedom that we're seeking. So they got aboard a ship called the Mayflower, and they headed that way. 102 pilgrims boarded this ship, all in agreement, the Mayflower Compact, all in agreement that they were going to America not to start an English colony. That was not their purpose. They wanted to start a Christian nation. That was their goal. They did not want anything to do with England anymore. They wanted the new Israel to be formed. Well, after James came King Charles I. Charles was also a zealous Catholic. He inherited the throne of England from his father James, and Charles became responsible for 20,000 Puritans leaving England and going to America. One of Charles' first acts was to disband Parliament. Now, can you imagine an American president saying, we don't need the House, we don't need the Senate, let's get rid of all these people, I'm going to run it all myself. That's what's happening here. Charles gets rid of all of Parliament so that he can sovereignly rule the United Kingdom. However, this doesn't happen without a fight. And the guy that stepped up to fight him was a man named Oliver Cromwell. So what you had was a political move that divided England between royalists who were very loyal to Charles, and then you had the Protestants who were, and Parliament, who were on the side of Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell ends up, long story short, defeating Charles and has him beheaded. And a Puritan government was put into place at a place called Westminster. And you would think that this would be a good thing, but it failed. It failed because Christians in England could not get along with each other. A lot like Christians today have a problem getting along with each other. It was easier to have a revolution than to draw up a constitution to abide by. So all of the fighting, trying to have this government, trying to have this Puritan government set into place just did not work out. And do you know what happened? England called upon William III and Queen Mary II from Scotland to come and rule from London and be the king and queen of the United Kingdom again. They reestablished the monarchy. The monarchy they fought so hard to oppose, they put it back into place. When this happened, 20,000 Puritans threw up their hands, said, we can't take this anymore. And they went to America to join the Pilgrims. Now, after this, the Puritans, the Protestants, and the Catholics will go to war for 30 years. And in this 30-year period, 35% of Europe will die. It is a bloody war. It's called the 30 Years' War. Now, it's important to know, over in the New World, over in America, the second wave of English Puritans did not want religious toleration. They wanted religious freedom. So their theology of starting a new world was heavily based on the Bible, but it was big time in error. Let me explain. They believed themselves to be the new Israel. They called their leaders Joshua and Caleb. And they saw the Native American Indian tribes. They saw them, the Mohawk, the Huron, the Iroquois. They called them Canaanites. And they said, it is our job to do to the Canaanites in America what David did to the Philistines in the Bible. We need to wipe them out. We need to get them out of the way. They felt it was their mission to do that to the Native Americans living on American soil. Error, big time error. Puritans had very strong feelings that every child should be literate and that every child should be educated. In fact, not long after landing on the shores of America, the Puritans formed a college called Harvard. And Harvard was set up to educate Puritan ministers and hold them accountable for growing in piety. And this was the problem. And this sounds great, but the problem was that someone's spiritual growth was not deemed by the relationship they had with God. It was deemed by the practices that everyone could see. That's what they checked the box and said, well, you must be growing spiritually because you're doing all these things. You're reading the Bible, you're going to church, you're praying. So therefore you must be growing spiritually. It was not between a man and God. Spiritual growth now become accountable to another man who was running the college. The Puritans also believed in what was called covenant. That is infant baptism that brought one into the community. Salvation was only approved by these Puritans when they saw enough evidence to say you were saved. They had to have experience. They had to have what they called testimony, that they could know God had chosen you to be part of his people. Only then, if you had experience, you had a testimony, God has chosen you, proved it by your works and your actions, only then could you be able to vote, purchase land, or hold an office. Well, in an attempt to not to lose what they had, they really pressed hard on the kids to keep this way of life. And all this on the outside seems so positive and good that we really want to train these kids up. We want to hold them accountable. It seems so good, but it didn't work. And there's one reason why this movement did not work. Teenagers. The children of the Puritans did not have the same zeal that their parents had, their fathers and grandfathers had for building a new Israel. They could care less about that. They didn't care about living a pious life. They didn't care about holding office or voting or owning property. They could care less. They were raised in this and they rebelled against it. So what happened is that the Puritans saw this dream of the new Israel, the city of God, slipping away. So they went to what was called the halfway covenant. That is a compromise. Young adults could vote and hold office and own property, but they weren't able to take communion until they were proven that they were saved. This Puritan dream of a city of God. Let me tell you what really put a stake into the heart of this dream of having a city of God is when daughters of a couple of Puritan families learned voodoo from a Haitian slave by the name of Tituba. Tituba taught the daughters of some of these Puritan families how to practice voodoo. After some strange happenings, and there was strange happenings, take it for what it is, these girls claimed that they could point out every witch that lived in Salem. Well, the Puritans began to hold trials for witchcraft. And this is how they would do it. If a person was accused of being a witch, they would hold that person underwater for 5 minutes. If that person died, they were not a witch. If they lived after 5 minutes, they were a witch and they would be sentenced to death. The strangest thing. This is the mania known as the Salem witch trials. It led to the death of more than 20 women, 2 men, and even a dog being accused of being a witch. So by the 1700s, the colonies had been inundated with deism. Even Harvard had compromised itself. And America is desperately in need of a fresh wind. And that will come about with a phenomenon known as revival and what we call the First Great Awakening. But that's next week when we start talking about revival history.